welcome to the last conversation of the ceramic series. My name is Isabel Fish, for those who have not met me, and I am the founder of Rupigal. We are a private club for women, and we like to call ourselves modern day Medicis of the crafts, and we very much support the values of craft and want to promote and preserve the world of crafts so next generation have access to it. In April this year, the whole month was dedicated to ceramics, and I wanted to finish in style by inviting Dr. Sequoia Miller, who is the Curator-in-Chief at the Gardner Museum. The Gardner Museum, as you might know, is one of the leading museums in the world in terms of ceramics. It's in Toronto, and it was founded by very much a Medici-style couple, the Gardners. I'm going to now put the spotlight on Sequoia, and Sequoia, welcome. It's a pleasure to welcome you here at Rupigal. Thank you for taking the time to meeting with us and sharing your knowledge. Today we're going to be talking about contemporary ceramic in North America. But I wanted to know first a little bit more about you. How did you shared just now that your parents were slightly bohemian, and that's how you got your name, which is unusual. So now we're all extremely intrigued to know, how did you grow up? And
Right, absolutely. Sure, happy to speak to that a bit. And thank you, Isabel, for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here and happy to meet everyone and to speak to the group. And I am enthusiastic about your support for ceramics and for craft more broadly. So thanks for being engaged. So yes, I did mention just as we were logging on that my parents gave me this name, Sequoia. They were bohemians in New York. And in fact, I grew up in two places. I grew up in New York City in Lower Manhattan in Soho at the time that Soho was being colonized, we could say, by artists who were taking over industrial spaces. And I think most of us know the trajectory since the 1970s of both the neighborhood and the city. So I grew up there, and also in Maine, in rural Maine. So I had very much of an urban and a rural upbringing together. I'm not from California, however, where sequoia trees are from, but I did live on the West Coast for quite a long time. I'm American, I suppose, goes without saying, in spite of being in Toronto now. And I lived in near Seattle, Washington for quite a few years when I was a studio potter, actually. So I went to university and studied Russian, actually, and art history, and did a bit of work in museums and art galleries, and then decided to become a potter and pursued that path for quite a few years. And then about, I guess 12 years ago now, I decided to go back to school, and I started off with working toward a studio degree, but then soon realized that my questions were research driven and historically driven and theoretically driven rather than being materially driven. And so I earned a master's degree in decorative arts and design history, and then a PhD in art history with a focus in modern and contemporary art, material culture, and ceramics. And all of that together brought me to the Gardner Museum, where I have been happy to get to know the collection, the community, and the city over the last 3 years.
Right. So it's really interesting that you have this background as a studio artist. I mean, I suspect there are very few curators like you. Do you think that it gives you a closer understanding, a closer affinity for the material, the pieces?
Oh, absolutely it does, because whenever I look at something made out of ceramic, I sort of speculate on making it or how it was made, or I always also want to touch it all the time, which is both good and bad. I think with ceramics, that happens to a lot of us, that we always want to touch it. But I think for me in particular, because I, really spent quite a long time with like working my hands in the material and sort of thinking through the processes of making something in clay, that absolutely I feel like it informs my way of looking at, thinking about, and writing about ceramics now.
Mm. Do you still make?
I do a little bit. I was more active. So I was a full-time studio potter for all those years, so made quite a bit of work. And then during my PhD years, I kept a studio practice on the side, and I've been doing it a little bit in Toronto, but it's been tricky in my role at the museum to be able to find time to
Right.
be in the studio.
So can you explain to us a little bit what is the role of a curator? Because I think that everybody seems to have a different understanding of what it is. I have to tell you that my pet peeve is when I see everywhere on social media, on the most mindless sites or posts, or curated this, or curate your life, or curate your kitchen. It drives me insane because being a curator is such an expertise, and it requires so much knowledge and so much work. So I think it'd be great if we could know what a real curator does.
Well, the word to curator, or curating different aspects of our lives, actually, as you're saying, has completely come into more popular usage, and it really kind of dilutes the term in a sense. But it's effective as a marketing tool for the time being, anyway. In my experience, a curator does a number of things, and so there are, I would say, one sort of batch of activities is around stewardship. So a large role of being a curator is stewarding a collection. Of course, this depends a lot on what kind of institution you're in, and there are certainly curators who are attached to institutions and independent curators who are not stewarding collections. So it's not part of every curatorial role, but it is an integral role, particularly if you're at a collecting institution like the Gardner or any smaller or larger museum. So the second large sort of area has to do with interpretation. And that's where you, as a curator, you help to put a frame around a certain body of work or group of work, either by an individual artist or by a group of artists, to help to offer a way into it for viewers. I think, as we all know, so many, really everything in the world, but artworks in particular, can really be looked at in so many different ways. And we can draw out so many ideas or themes or questions from objects that oftentimes, if we're not sort of offered any kind of parameters around which to frame those questions, it's a bit like doing a Google search, right? And you just get like inundated with pink vases, say. A curatorial approach will help to frame the questions in a little bit more kind of confined way, so that can sort of guide or focus our understanding of the material and the questions we ask through it, or through the material. I would say also, in terms of curatorial practice today, there are two main sort of poles in that interpretive approach. One of those has to do with expertise, as you suggested, Isabel, that a sort of curatorial frame is informed by having knowledge and experience, and being able to say, like, the difference between a Sèvres piece from the 1780s versus the 1760s, and why they would look different from each other. That's a sort of expert knowledge. There's also a way of thinking about curatorship that's more about framing questions and about framing responses to objects that certainly can be anchored in the specific knowledge of the work, but can also be broader and relate more specifically to our individual lives.
Right. I think that that framing the question is a way to teach us how to look at a piece, because often we don't know, we don't have the tools to look beyond the purely aesthetic frame that we know that is part of our life, and seeing a piece of work in different exhibitions with different questions that frame it is another way to teach us how to look at a piece. So let's start. Maybe you have put together a list of artists that you have chosen. Before we go there, where is Canadian ceramic at the moment in terms of, ceramic? We've been doing ceramic around the world for the past month, and we've seen a lot of things. But if we have a museum as important as the Gardner in Canada, it must have an impact on the field of ceramic in Canada. So can you tell us a little bit where the artists are, where do we fit in the picture?
I would say, yeah, sure. I would say that the Canadian ceramics in the broad sense is healthy and vigorous, and there's a lot of artists really making a lot of phenomenal work. It's fantastic that you've been able to sort of focus on the global and then to kind of narrow in a bit. I'll be speaking today about artists who are based in Canada and the US principally, because as in many aspects of our culture, there's a lot of intersection between Canadian and American activity. Quite a few Canadian ceramic artists will study in the US and then come back to Canada. As well, a number of artists, Canadian artists will settle in the US and will sell their work there or exhibit there. And of course, many go back and forth. I would say I mean, on the whole, as you've probably discovered already, contemporary ceramics is a very strong, active, vibrant, and diverse field right now. And it's really phenomenal how kind of rich the ecology has come around ceramics. It's always been, you know, dynamic in a number of ways, but really in the last, say, 10 years or so, there's been an increase, I would say, in the literacy within the culture of what ceramic is and what it can look like. I think for quite a long time, there was a very strong bias against our sort of lack of information, lack of understanding around what ceramics could be. And I think that their broader and broader audiences are starting to see, oh, wow, like it can look like this and it can look like that. And it can be in these, you know, room-sized sculptures, but it's also still a cup. And there are all these really interesting ways through it.
Is there a school or university in Canada that has a program for ceramic?
Yeah, for sure. So there's a couple. The main undergraduate program is at Sheridan College, which is outside of Toronto. It is in I don't think it's in Hamilton. I'm sort of not remembering the exact town, but it's near Toronto, and that's sort of within a craft program. Then there are a number of other programs that are at larger universities. So Nova Scotia at NSCAD, Nova Scotia College of Art and Design University is a big program, and as well Emily Carr in Vancouver is a big program too.
Okay, great. So let's dive in. I'm going to share my screen and the presentation that you created. We'll come back to that piece. I love that piece. I know that it has also a special place in the Gardner collection. So you chose some themes, and we're starting with figuration here.
Yeah, I thought it would be great to start both with the artist Sherry Boyle, a work of whose we're looking at now, and with figuration as one of the ways, sort of the ways into contemporary ceramics. And Sherry Boyle is really a phenomenal artist. Particularly for those of you that are Canadian, I think she may be familiar to some of you. She's widely exhibited and widely loved in Canada and internationally. Sherry is known for her figurative work, working with images of the human body in all sorts of configurations. Sherry was trained as a two-dimensional artist. She does quite a lot of painting and drawing. She also has what she calls a live drawing practice, which is a sort of performance-based drawing. And she has been active since kind of the mid-1990s. And in the early 2000s, she started working sculpturally and started working with ceramic. And she began to make adapt her figurative two-dimensional idiom into a three-dimensional world and using clay. So what we're looking at here is a sculpture that's about 18 inches high or so. So not diminutive, but also not, you know, life size or gargantuan. And it's called the Potter, or actually the Potter 2. And you can probably tell, but if you turn the work on its side, you would see that the figure does not have a head. So instead, the potter is sitting in front of what looks like a potter's wheel in a way, but has this kind of vertical column of different ceramic forms with what's actually made to look like a Greek vase in the place of the head. And Sherry is doing a number of wonderful things in this work. And one is she's kind of riffing on the history of ceramics. So as we go up the column of pots, we can see that the bottom one looks like a vase. It's white with blue painting, so it evokes Chinese blue and white porcelain. So that's white porcelain with cobalt blue ornamentation on it. The next piece up just above the hands is pink and gold. So I've mentioned Sèvres now a couple of times. So this would be evocative of a Sèvres piece from the late 18th century. Then there's another sort of smaller blue and white form that looks a bit like what we would call an albarello or an Italian apothecary jar, might be familiar to some of you. The Greek vase, of course, that is the head, kind of classical tradition of figurative ceramics, and then this white pitcher on top, which looks, less specific, but is more of maybe a 19th or early 20th century ceramic form. So Sherry's doing a bunch of things in this work. One is she's really kind of drawing from and riffing on ceramic history, which is something that we'll see across quite a few of the artists. Two, she's working with figuration and with the idea of depicting the human body or the human form in clay, which of course goes back to, prehistoric times. People find unfired ceramic clay figures and figurines, from 20,000 years ago and more. So the idea of the ceramic figure or figurine is one of the sort of through lines of ceramic sculpture. And Sherry's adopting some of these tropes and sort of using them to create a kind of a slightly kind of magical or sort of mythical kind of world that the world of Sherry's work is always it's evocative, it's a little mysterious, it's not perfectly literal, but rather has these kind of leaps of imagination and surprise, often the uncanny. And she's working with some of those ideas in this piece. And the last comment that I'll add about this piece is that it's really expertly executed. So if you look at the work, there's a very high degree of craft, a very high degree of skill. Sherry is masterful in executing her work. And if you can advance to the next image, Isabel, we'll see that we'll see these are two more of Sherry's works. The piece on the left is called Snowball, and the piece on the right is called Oasis. And Snowball is from the first series that Sherry exhibited in ceramic. As I mentioned, she was trained initially as a two-dimensional artist and started working in clay, somewhat into her career. And she really became interested in 18th century figurines, in European porcelain figurines, particularly Meissen. So this one called Snowball replicates a surface on some Meissen ceramics from the 18th century. And there's a bunch of teeny little flowers that entirely cover the work. And what Sherry's doing a number of things in this Snowball piece, but one of the things, again, that I want to emphasize is how she's drawing from history. She's adopting really explicitly the scale, the tropes, the tones, the materials of, in this case, 18th century porcelain, but she's really inverting the content of it and sort of presents this kind of elite figure as if she's overwhelmed, sort of overcome by the kind of the weight of sort of ideas of femininity from 18th century Europe. The piece on the right, so piece on the left, 2006, the piece on the right is from 2020. So it's from the same series as the Potter, and this is called Oasis. And so this piece is, it's a little hard to see the detail here, but it's sort of representing a non-binary, gender ambiguous person. And here Sherry is thinking about how porcelain in particular presents a sort of sensuality that can both be gendered and can be non-gendered or non-binary, as well as being gendered. So in these works, Sherry's also looking at some social themes around femininity, around sort of gender identity. This piece, Oasis, and the previous piece, The Potter 2, are two works of Sherry Boyle's that are part of a larger project that she has been working on for the Gardner Museum. They are for an exhibition that is called Outside the Palace of Me. This is a major installation-based exhibition, and I think we have one more image of Sherry's work, if that's right, Isabel. Yeah, so this piece is also from Outside the Palace of Me, and this is an exhibition that we had scheduled for the Gardner to be on right now, but we've had to postpone it, so we'll be featuring it next year at the museum from late February into mid-May. And Outside the Palace of Me is a major project from Sherry Boyle, where she's using quite a wide range of sculptures and materials and approaches to really ask questions about our identities and how we come to understand who we are, both on our own and through each other. So the piece that we're looking at now is called Judy, and Judy refers to the Black figure on the right of the image. which is a four-armed, it's this four-armed figure. So the figure Judy is actually life-size, and again has these four arms. Each arm has a puppet and is standing in front of a kind of Looney Tunes sort of spiral. The other figure, the black, the fully black figure with the long white hair, that's actually a live person in this image. That's a dancer. And this snapshot was taken while we were filming a performance in the exhibition. So earlier this winter, we had actually installed the full exhibition as a way to document it and to publish the catalog. The project is now going to premiere, rather than at the Gardner, it will premiere at the Rooms in Newfoundland in late September. And as I mentioned, come to the Gardner next year. So I wanted to bring up this project because Sherry Boyle's work really touches on kind of the full range of themes that I wanted to bring to the table today around contemporary ceramics. So I'm introducing her work as an aspect of figuration, but also want to speak to Sherry's work with a range of disciplines. She works not just in ceramics, but in other media. Her work also involves an element of social critique. She is absolutely explicitly drawing from history, both in ceramics and other materials. And there's also a sort of visual lushness or richness to her work. There's a lot to look at. It's highly chromatic. It's really beautiful. It's really skillfully executed. And I'll come back to each of those themes.
Can I ask you on these pieces, is it clothing that robes the ceramic statue, or what is ceramic and what isn't?
So in the previous works, the entire pieces were ceramic. So
Yeah.
the Potter, Oasis, and Snowball, those were fully ceramic. In this piece, the ceramic elements are in the puppets, and only in the puppets, actually, which is a great example of kind of the complexity of Sherry's work. So the figure Judy, who's dressed, so remember the one with the black hands and the long white hair, that's a live dancer, like in a costume. So in terms of sculpture, the figure Judy in the black clothing is, it's almost like a mannequin in a way, but it's also what we would call an automaton in that it's moving. It has mobile parts to it. So if you can make it out, one of the four hands is holding a marionette rather than a hand puppet. So the hand that we can see, the one that's holding the marionette, is mechanized. And so that'll move during the course of the exhibition. It's made actually out of a kind of silicone, as is the head and the face. So I strongly encourage you to come and see this exhibition when it's at the Gardner, or perhaps in Newfoundland. It'll be touring, we anticipate, across Canada. So in this is Sherry really using this wide range of materials: latex, human hair, like motors, ceramic, textiles, to really create this full world.
Thank you.
So we're sticking with figuration for a little bit, even though these don't really look like figures. This is another artist that I wanted to bring into the conversation around figuration. And the way that I've structured the presentation today is that there's usually two or maybe three artists for each one of these themes. And I've tried to focus on an artist who's very well established, like Sherry Boyle, as well as an artist who's more of an emerging artist, a little bit of an up-and-comer. So in this case, we're looking at the work of an American artist named Brie Rouet. And Brie is, she's kind of in between emerging and established. She's been showing for a number of years. Her work is widely recognized. She's in a number of public and private collections, but she's still, kind of coming into broader audiences. So what we're looking at here are three sculptures that are kind of pushed against a wall, or they're actually made leaning up against a wall. They include both fired clay and raw clay. And Brie Rouet is working in this figurative idiom, but she's actually not making a representational figure. And so what's figurative about this work is how the artist is working with the material. So a couple of things. One is that she starts off, each one of these pieces is made of the amount of clay that's equivalent to her body weight. And so this typically will figure into the titling of the works. So for these pieces, she happened to weigh 130 pounds when she made them. So each of these figures, we could say, or pushes, is made out of her body weight in clay. So it's a way of representing her physical presence. If you could advance to the next slide, please, Isabel.
How tall are these pieces? Because 130 pounds of clay is a lot of clay.
It's actually not. I mean, a clay's heavy. That's right. The thing. Okay. So, I mean, it's like a pile or something. So these are maybe I wonder if I have in my notes. Yeah, I don't have the exact height in front of me, but I'm guessing they're about 4.5 feet high, 4 feet, something like that. And that's actually a great question because it speaks to the idea of how far Brie's body can extend. And this is another huge part of her work, but it's a little easier to see in the next image, I think. So another kind of work that's typical of Brie's would be like the sort of starburst or sunburst form that's in the center. So what we're looking at here is a photograph of a sculpture by Brie, which is in the center square. This image is from her website. So the sculpture that's in the center square is about 5.5 feet in diameter or so. So, substantial, but not, it's not like the size of a large wall. And then it's overlaid on an aerial photograph of the desert. So the sort of sandy background and kind of the loop form that we're seeing is a photograph of Brie Ruiz. So in this piece called Making Space from the Inside, the artist has again taken her body weight in clay, but then she's put herself at the center of that amount of clay, and she's pushed outward. So the width, the radius of the piece, we could say, is the reach of her arms. It's directly connected to the length, to sort of how far she can stay, keep her torso in the center, and extend her body outward. So this piece, in that way, is I would argue, is figurative. It's directly connected to Brie's body and to her experience of being a person within her body. So this is kind of obviously a kind of broader take on what the notion of figuration is, and I think really speaks to a way of working with representation and the figure that is more conceptual and sort of broader, and in fact drawing less specifically from older histories of ceramics and ceramic artwork. Because of the photograph here, you can see that Brie is thinking about land art. So rather than drawing from ceramic history, she's thinking more about modern and contemporary art history. Those of you that aren't familiar, land art was a movement that started in the 1960s of making these very large kind of earthworks, is the other name for it, very large works out of the earth, sculptural works out of the earth, frequently in deserts. So Michael Heiser comes to mind, Robert Smithson. These are some of the well-known earthwork or landwork artists. It was a lot of men, especially in the 1960s and 70s, and had a sort of macho edge to it, where it was about like using a bulldozer to make your like big macho artwork. And here Brie Ruiz is thinking about the role of her body and her experience kind of in the landscape as she says, as a queer white woman.
Before we carry on, I forgot to say at the beginning, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box, and we'll take the questions as we go along.
So again, I've spoken about Sherry as being sort of relevant to all of the themes in the conversation today. And her work, as I mentioned, is interdisciplinary, trained as a 2D artist, working in ceramic, has just completed this large installation. So the second theme after figuration that I'd like to bring up is this topic of installation and interdisciplinarity. And really, one of the artists who's most emblematic of this approach to ceramics is Theaster Gates, also an American artist. He's based in Chicago and very closely associated with the city of Chicago. The image here is from an exhibition that he had at the Gagosian Gallery in New York in 2019 and into 2020. And the show is called Black Vessel, and it included these kind of large-scale ceramic objects, which you're seeing on various kind of plinths and risers that are, of course, sculptural in themselves, as well as two-dimensional artworks on the walls. Theaster Gates works within a really incredibly broad range of approaches in his artistic practice, and it includes making discrete objects, discrete sort of sculptural ceramic objects, but it also includes large installations as well as social practice pieces. And that's a really key part of how a wide range of artists are thinking about ceramics. I'll point out also in this image that Theaster Gates is drawing from ceramic history, but not in as sort of a specific way, for example, as Sherry Boyle was with the Snowball piece, where Sherry Boyle was referencing a very specific kind of artwork that was made in one place at a certain time. Theaster Gates is thinking about, I would say, Japanese ceramics in particular, but also early American stoneware that was made by Black potters in particular as well. He's pulling from these two approaches, but he's making something very much his own and within his own visual language. So I would describe this as historically informed and historically resonant without being as specific. So in the next image, what we'll see is we see two images that both relate to this Dorchester project in Dorchester Industries. So Theaster Gates is an amazingly interesting and really unusual artist in that he was trained in ceramics and also in urban planning. And he worked as an urban planner for a number of years. And his approach to his artistic work spans this background of his, where he makes these ceramic objects, like I'm saying, he creates these installations, but he also creates community centers. And that's what this Dorchester project is. So a number of years ago, Theaster Gates purchased these two buildings on the south side of Chicago in a very kind of poor neighborhood, and he has converted them into a community center. And they actively now have this whole kind of swath of programming for folks in the community. It includes this Dorchester Industries, which is the image of the ceramics here on the right, which has to do with training people in the community to make things and to make things that can then be sold and be part of their lives and their livelihood on an ongoing basis. This is what I would think of or categorize as a social practice artist, or an aspect of his work that's social practice. So it's installation in the broad sense. It's this idea that an entire building or a couple of buildings can hold or contain an artistic project while also being a community space and involving the making of ceramics. So it's really about ceramics playing a role in this larger project. Okay, so sticking with installation for a little bit, Theaster Gates being the more established of the two artists. The second artist who works with installation that I'd like to discuss is an artist named Nadia Mir. Nadia Mir is a Canadian artist of Algonquin and mixed heritage. She's based in Montreal, teaches at Concordia, and has been active across a pretty wide spectrum for the last 10 or 12 years. Her background was principally in photography and performance and, again, social practice. She has also worked in quite a wide range of specific media, including beadworking and, in the last few years, ceramics. And if you could advance to the next screen, we'll see a close-up shot of a basket of hers that was made as part of this exhibition called Code Switching from 2018 that was presented in Glasgow. And then elements of it have since been presented in Toronto and elsewhere. So what we're looking at here is a ceramic object. It's a ceramic sculpture that is a basket form. As you can see, it's kind of a cylindrical form with a lid, but it's soft. It has this kind of like mushy, very body-like feel. So thinking about figuration again is still relevant here. We can see that this basket is made out of these kind of smaller sections, and these are actually beads. So these are ceramic beads. They're about maybe 3 centimeters long on average, but as you can see on the lid, they get smaller. And these beads are connected to wampum. Nadia is drawing this amazing relationship between ceramics as a medium and shell, which was used initially for wampum to create belts and other types of beadwork. Nadia Mir started using ceramic in a wampum-like idiom when she was in a residency, on an artist residency in London. And many of you will know that the Thames as a tidal river reveals its kind of muddy banks that are always kind of turning up new objects. And Nadia was fascinated by the pipe stems that she was finding. And she's since adopted this idiom of the pipe stem. So if you think of like 17th or 18th century pipes, you know, these like white clay pipes with a long stem and a small bowl, and that the stem would be snapped off with use. Those little snappings are part of what gets turned up in the Thames. And Nadia collected those and saw a relationship between the pipe stems and wampum, as well as the relationship between settlers and indigenous folks in North America. And so she's been working at the intersection of wampum and ceramics now for a couple of years, and it's both like materially rich and beautiful, but also completely resonant and deeply moving, I find. You'll see in the background, there's a wallpaper that's part of Nadia's work, as well as works on the wall that are photographic and bead-based. So here I want to again emphasize that Nadia's working in an installation interdisciplinary idiom using a wide range of materials, and ceramics is part of this very complex mix of approaches that is brought in for its specificity and for its particular material meanings and resonances, but exists within this kind of complex ecology.
I find this piece very touching. I mean, a basket is always an object that is very special because of its gathering function, but the fact that it is soft to me makes it very almost motherly, like I'm taking you in and I'm soft and I still protect you. I thought that photo, that piece was very, very moving. The word that we learned not so long ago about looking for objects in the Thames River is called mudlarking.
Yes,
And,
mudlarking,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, it's the best thing.
It's a beautiful word.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing.
There's Andrea saying that her work in the current exhibition at McMichael, as well as in the Indigenous galleries at the AGO. And that's where we can see the work of Nadia Meyer.
Yeah, thanks for that. So one of the baskets is in the AGO and a kind of ceramic wampum piece is at the McMichael.
Mm-hmm.
So the last, Nadia's work that we were just looking at in the installation code switching, as I alluded to, kind of related to these questions about settler and indigenous relations and coloniality and and adopted ceramics and pipes as a way of kind of thinking about some of these relationships. And this points to this broader idea of a social critique, which I think is a way of kind of capturing another approach that is really central to a number of artists. It came up in a way with the Astor Gates and with Sherry Boyle as well. And I'd like to focus now on an artist named Simone Lee, who is also widely known and widely appreciated. And her work has a social critique element to it in one sense, but it's also very much just about being in sort of fully inhabiting the perspective that she occupies. So Simone Lee is an American artist. We're looking at a piece here that's probably about 12 feet high. So I would describe this as monumental. The figurative part or the ceramic part is the kind of figurative part on top from roughly the waist up. That's about life size or a little bit under life size. And then it's under this big raffia sort of hoop, which has a metal frame underneath it. And in Simone Lee's work, some of these big raffia hoops have openings in them so that you can enter them, typically from the back, and then some of them are fully clothed. Simone Lee is drawing from a range of sources in her work. She's looking at historical ceramics, absolutely. I think you can probably see that she's also drawing from architectural traditions, both in the American South more broadly, and also in Africa. She's interested in these structures that were everyday structures that people built, rather than sort of monumental structures that were about declaring power in a large kind of concrete way. So Simone Lee is a Black American woman, and she speaks of her work as speaking to Black female subjectivity. She said in the past that this is the audience that she's going for in her work and sort of the way that she wants to speak about her work. And I think here you're also seeing, again, these intersecting themes that I'm drawing out. So we have figuration here as well. We have an installation type idiom here. If you could advance to the next image, please. Isabel.
I'm seeing a Marie Antoinette dress there, but that's just me.
Right. Well, I think that speaks to kind of the complexity of the play. And for me, a really strong sculptor, a really strong artist is able to bring all of these associations together that seem like they would be at odds, like an 18th century dress and vernacular African architecture, but can find sort of the intersection or the overlap between those and have those at play. Absolutely.
And the empty jar as the head, as a vessel to receive knowledge, and as also again a mother figure is really interesting.
The notion of the human, like the human body, the head or the full body as being a vessel or as being a container is, of course, has long associations. We saw that in the Greek vase that Sherry Boyle referenced. We're seeing it here. We see it in other parts of Simone Lee's work. It's really a way, we see it in some of the other artists that I'll be talking about today. Yeah, it's a critical way that we, I think, connect on a conceptual level to containers, to vessels. And that's one reason why baskets and vases are so often resonant for us. So in these, I think in this piece, we're seeing this that same kind of connection, the piece on the left, the face jug, in a really explicit way. So when I look at this, I think about the, the Greek vases that have heads in the middle of them. I think also about face jugs as they were made in the American South. There's a tradition of making stoneware jugs that have porcelain inclusions that depict faces. It's widely thought that the face jugs from the American South that were made in the 18th and 19th century were connected to African religious traditions that were expressed in this new idiom while folks were enslaved. I would also point out in Simone Lee's work that even though it has this figurative element, you can see in this piece, as is typical, she does not include eyes on her work. And for me, I feel like that's a way for her to retain a kind of distance or a sort of universality to the work, in that she does not seem to be speaking about a particular personality or singular point of view or perspective, but it's more about personhood or about womanhood or about subjectivity in a broader sense, rather than an individual kind of psychological history or interior. If we think about, for example, Sherry Boyle's use of figuration, that figure Judy with the forearms and the puppets, that was really like a specific person in a way who we could imagine having a story and a life and questions and anxieties. And this piece, the face jug, I feel like speaks to a much broader sense of humanity or femininity or womanhood. So if we're thinking about this idea of social critique as being part of the work and kind of one of the main themes for artists today, and Simone Lee as being a very established artist in the US in this kind of general idea, Roberto Lugo is an emerging artist who's working in this way as well. And Roberto Lugo makes this really, really powerful and beautiful and visually interesting and rich work that is also offering a critique for how we understand ourselves and in particular racial dynamics in the US. So Rob Lugo is an American artist born and raised in Philadelphia. The piece that we're looking at here is from about 5 years ago, and it's called All About the Benjamins Century Vase. And for those of us with backgrounds in American decorative arts, we'll know the century vase right away, but lots of us don't, will never have seen or noticed them before. But the century vase is a particular kind of vase that was made in 1876 and 77 at a place called Union Porcelain Works, which was in New York City, and was made by a guy named Carl Mueller, who was a German ceramic artist who emigrated to the United States and sort of helped the American ceramic industry get rolling. He was a designer, I should say, rather than an artist. So in Philadelphia, there was a large, one of the kind of international expositions or world fairs that were so dominant, particularly in the 19th century. There was a large centennial exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876, of course, on the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And so there was this series of century vases that were made, and they're now principally in museums in the US. And it was a way of sort of declaring American exceptionalism, in a sense, manifest destiny, sort of the kind of democratic ideals and patriotic symbols. And it included, as two handles on the sides, these two buffalo heads. So I think since then, a lot of these 19th century notions of American patriotism and identity have certainly come under question and critique. And And that's just what Roberto Lugo is doing in this piece. So you can see that he's swapped out the buffalo heads for other animals. He's added a lot of gold and sort of this rich textile-like background. And in the center, he has a picture of Benjamin Franklin with kind of a banner on it. And the title of the work, All About the Benjamins, is a reference to a rap song, a hip hop song by Puff Daddy. And Benjamins in this context means $100 bills, because in the US, of course, Benjamin Franklin is the president who is on the $100 bill. And what Rob Lugo is doing is he's bringing his own kind of life and experience to this set of questions around what it means to be American and what are the legacies that we live with in the United States and in Canada, of course, in a different way. And how do we sort of reconcile those? Rob Lugo speaks of himself as a ghetto potter or as a hip hop potter. He speaks often about how he was raised in a community where kind of being an artist wasn't an option. Going to university was not common or expected of him. He wasn't anticipated, to sort of have a life and a career as an artist. He's now really kind of pretty broadly celebrated. His work is actually this piece is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. He, I think the next image has a commission from the Walters Museum, which is in Baltimore. And this is one way or an example by which this particular artist, Roberto Lugo, is really engaging with these questions of history and his own identity and social critique from a historical point of view. So in the way that he took the century vase and kind of thought about what it could mean to him at this moment, he's also looking in this work at a garniture and thinking about what a garniture for today would look like, and a garniture from his vantage point. So many of us will be familiar with the idea of a garniture as being a series of usually 5, but sometimes 3 or 7 vases or vase forms that would be initially on top of an armoire type chest, or often frequently a little bit later on top of a mantelpiece, as you're seeing here. These garniture sets became popular through the growth of global trade in the 16th and especially in the 17th century. So in a lot of historical houses in Western Europe, in particular in the UK and in the US and somewhat in Canada and in France and Germany, we'll see these garniture sets that have a sort of series of jars across a mantelpiece. And the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, as I mentioned, commissioned Roberto Lugo to make a series of works for as a historic house that's part of the museum. So the piece that's highlighted here is a jar. It's probably about 22 inches high, and it has an image of Colin Kaepernick on the side of it, again with these kind of textile-like swatches and patches. On the opposite side, it has an image of John Brown, a well-known abolitionist from the 19th century in the US. And this is Roberto Lugo asking us to look at this sort of historical expression of wealth and elite sophistication through a lens of the social dynamics today.
I think it's really important to see that such contemporary event that could be forgotten because we are so bombarded with images is already, I want to say, immortalized in a piece of art. And in a way, it ensures that the next generations will know about it, will hear the story, rather than possibly just disappearing. The story of Colin Kaepernick is really important.
Absolutely. And it really speaks to this question of like, what is important to memorialize and what's important to remember, and who has the authority or the voice or the resources to do that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about, here we have a comment about Nadia Muir and calling in Courtney Leonard into the conversation. Not seeing the full comment, but absolutely, that's a great connection. So Courtney Leonard is a fantastic artist. I suggest you Google her, or you can go to the Gardner's YouTube page and see a conversation that I had with Courtney from a few weeks back. Really fantastic artist. Okay, so let's see. So far we've talked about figuration, we've talked about installation and interdisciplinarity, and we've talked about social critique. So the fourth theme that I'd like to bring up, I'm calling World of Objects. And this is to highlight a number of artists who are making basically household objects out of clay, kind of everyday objects, and giving them a different kind of life and a different kind of animation. In this section, I'll highlight works by two artists who are both in the emerging category, rather than one being more established than the other particularly. This kind of work can have a lot of sort of lineages for sure, but one that would be more widely sort of linked to is the notion of funk ceramics, which came out of California in the 1960s and 70s and involved a number of artists who started to make everyday objects, like household objects, out of clay, and made them in a way that they were recognizable, but not trying to be super precise or super accurate. And they made also objects, artists like Robert Arneson or David Gillooly made objects like toilets and typewriters, and not like sort of elite forms like the jar that we were just looking at by Rob Lugo, but like everyday objects. So yes, that's funk ceramics, F-U-N-K, which was part of a larger kind of movement around funk art more broadly. Again, from the 60s and 70s initially. So the work that we're looking at here, though, is by an artist named Woody Diathello. Woody Diathello is from Florida, but has been in Northern California for some time. And he is an artist who has worked across a range of media, but is really focused on ceramics in the last 10 years or so. And I think we can see in his work, we're looking at an air conditioner and a couple of faucets. We can see this everyday object that has become animated a little bit. It's a little playful, a little cartoon-like. In a way, he imbues a kind of psychological presence to these forms. So rather than making something clinical or something kind of industrial, they have a little bit of attitude or character, or kind of, you know, they're talking back to us in some ways. In a way, we could also think of these works as being figurative, in that they're kind of taking on personalities and body-like forms, like those faucets look almost like arms in some ways, or other appendages. There's also a political or a social critique dimension to a lot of Woody Diathello's work. So he makes a number of objects like this air conditioner piece that relate to air and airflow. And he's spoken about how, for him, he's thinking about, I can't breathe. He's thinking about these questions of like, who has breath and who retains breath. Woody is an African-American artist. His origin is Haitian. His family emigrated to the US from Haiti. And so he's, in a way, thinking about some of these pretty kind of top of mind sort of social questions, but approaching them not through a kind of didactic idiom or a direct idiom, or even a directly figurative idiom, but instead thinking about, again, this notion of breath and being able to breathe, and what it means to say, I can't breathe, through a kind of household object, through something that visualizes air circulation in a different way. So another artist who's making objects is this fabulous artist named Genesis Bellanche. And Genesis has been, was trained as a sculptor and is working in ceramic more broadly. And you can see in the work that she's making that it's also representational, but has this kind of really funny and odd sort of sense to it. So we're looking at two kind of groups of work. So the piece on the left is from a project called Holding Pattern, which was an exhibition at the New Museum in New York City. And Holding Pattern was actually set up like in the window of the museum. So there was this table-like tableau with these objects on it, like, as you can see, a food and a kind of a tape dispenser sort of thing, and a pop can kind of thing. And the objects, as in both projects, have this kind of pastel palette where everything is sort of muted and soft. And it's kind of beautiful and lush and rich, but also a little cool and a little alien in some way. The image on the right is from an installation, again, installation work, called Through the Eye of the Needle. This is, I think it might still be on view, or it was on view recently at the Aldrich Museum in Connecticut. And in Through the Eye of a Needle, the artist is presenting this kind of very somber kind of, it's it's strange in that the work is both sort of lush and rich and very beautiful, but it's also very alienating and feels almost funereal in a sense. It's, you know, there's this absence of people, but then there are these body parts that come through that are represented, like there'll be a mouth or an ear or some kind of lips or an eyeball that kind of pops up. And it's clearly both in the ceramic, but also in the textile, again, in this very kind of consistent palette that makes it sort of otherworldly in a way. We're seeing also one contrast between these two artists is that Woody Diathello is working again in an idiom that I connect to funk a little bit, in that it's looser, it's a little bit mushier, it's a little bit kind of what happens. Whereas Genesis Bellanche seems to be in a very kind of controlled idiom. Everything is very precisely executed and set up to be very consistent visually.
It's a little soulless, I find it.
It's very cool, but I think one thing that I love about it is that it's both. It is connected to pop art, absolutely. It has this kind of cool edge to it, but it also has this kind of haunted quality that lies underneath it that makes it a little more, a little unsettling and a little more sort of emotionally driven in a way. But it's also absolutely working at that register of. I mean, the artist actually worked in advertising for a number of years, so it has the sense of like a kind of like a tableau that would have been sort of created for a spread, for like the idea of what a table with food on it would look like, rather than somebody's particular objects that they live with.
Mm-hmm.
Okie doke. So here's the fifth one, rich abstractions. And this is the last of the kind of general sort of themes that I'll be presenting. And I wanted to highlight a number of artists who are making abstract sculpture. I would say good old abstract sculpture in a sort of modernist or kind of formalist way. So one of the really leading figures who I feel like makes incredibly strong work is an artist named Arlene Scheckett. And Arlene is based in New York City and in upstate New York, and has been working across the kind of sculptural idiom for maybe 30 years or so. And she's really been focusing on ceramics, especially in the last maybe 15 or even 20 years. And for her, she has this fantastic balance in her work, I think, between a kind of ceramic specific approach, in that she absolutely is keyed in to all the nuances of the medium and what the medium can do visually and materially and physically, and kind of how it can make you feel when you're standing there looking at it. And yet at the same time, she's not confined by the ceramics discourse. Her work really speaks to these bigger questions about what sculpture is and how abstract sculpture functions. And there's such a productive tension between those two approaches, I find. So the work that we're looking at here is actually predominantly wood. So the ceramic element is on the bottom on the right, the kind of round, sort of brownish element. And the most of the other aspects of this piece are wood. I think of Arlene Scheckett as being sort of a rigorous abstract artist, in that her work is meant to be provocative and associational without being literal. It's not drawn to specific content. She's not drawing our thinking or our eye or our associations to a specific subject matter. Rather, it's the visual encounter, it's the work of art itself. Looking at the second piece from her, so the piece we were just looking at was from the last year or so, from 2019, and this piece is from 2016 and is more typical of her sculpture that is predominantly ceramic. So this would be a single ceramic object. It's probably about 22, 24 inches high. It has a whitish glaze. In person, that surface or that glaze would have a ton of nuance to it. It would be very kind of rich and kind of bubbly. She often has these like little bits of color kind of tucked in. She's working with sort of voids, like positives and voids. So much like in the other piece where we could see through elements of this, you can see that there are a couple of openings here. So she, in a way, she's asking these questions about breath, a little bit like Woody Diathello, but also, evoking a bit like Simone Lee, this question of vessel and body. Like there's something soft about this that looks like a body or like a skin. but we never get so deep into any one association that we say, oh yeah, this work is about the body, or this work is about breath, or this work is about something. Instead, it keeps us in this kind of contingent zone where the work is really, on a fundamental level, I think, about itself and about our encounter with it. So Arlene is an established abstract artist. We'll end by pointing out two artists who are both Canadian who are also working in abstract idioms. So this is a piece by Julie Moon, and this is a work that is related to the work that we open the conversation with. This work is called Moon Foliage, and the work that opened the conversation is called Disco Tree, and these are both from a series called Acid Garden. Julie presented this series at Birch Contemporary Gallery here in Toronto a couple of years ago. And they're part of this rich sort of stream in her work, which is around abstract sculpture. Julie is making these works in reference to kind of plant growth and plant forms. So she's using as a springboard the idea of a sort of botanical structure, but you can see that she's not interested in depicting a particular plant or a particular life form, but rather she's kind of pushing it through this lens that is that's primarily formal. It's about how it looks and what our experience is of looking at it. You can see with all the kind of zigzags on here and the pointy edges and the kind of high contrast between the green and the orange. I think Julie's really looking to make us a little unsettled. It's a little anxious. It's a little, zazzy. It's like it wants to be a little bit of an irritant while also being a bit of a stimulant. So this is Julie kind of working in this abstract idiom to make something that kind of vibrates a little bit for us visually. Here's a Disco Tree. So this is, again, from the same series. This piece is probably about 3.5 feet high, I would say. The previous piece a little bit smaller. So from the title, we can tell the kind of botanical reference. It also looks a little bit like a cactus, but it's really not made to like depict any particular form, as I'm saying. Instead, it's made just to look at. It's made to be engaged with kind of visually. Julie she has a studio here in Toronto in the Distillery District. She works both in the sculptural idiom, but she also makes vessels. So she has a series of pots that she makes, mostly vase forms. And in addition, she also makes a line of jewelry. So Julie is an artist who is, taking multiple approaches to how she's working in ceramic, which is also, in some sense, typical of the way that a number of artists are working. This piece, I'm happy to say, is entering the Gardner collection too. Yay. As is this is the last work that we'll be talking about. And this is a piece by an amazing artist named Linda Sorman that I'm also happy to say has just been promised to the Gardner Museum. So we're super excited about having this coming into the collection and being able to put it on view soon. And one thing that you'll notice immediately about this piece is that it's hard to see, like it's hard to know what we're looking at, right? It's like messy in a way. So this work, it's roughly the scale of Disco Tree. So it's maybe a little smaller. It's about 2.5 or 3 feet high. It has this kind of web or lattice-like central element. On the bottom right, you're seeing something more solid. This piece is very much within the kind of aesthetic idiom of Linda Swarman. So Linda Swarman is a Canadian artist. She went to Sheridan. She trained at Alfred University in the US, and she's currently based in New York. And she works in a way that she builds up her work intuitively as she goes, and she draws in whatever's around. It's kind of like a bricoleur, or a way of kind of picking up what's at hand and incorporating that into the work. Linda Sorman is well known for including like shards of ceramics that she finds in various places. She'll pick up abandoned scraps in a studio, and say in an educational studio. She'll also use scrap glazes. She uses a lot of kind of scrap material and builds up the work. She's not precious about the work in that she'll break it and then continue adding on to it. This piece, you can see in the title, which is half in the Thai language and then has this English name, Karns. This piece is an homage of sorts to an artist named Karns. Karns was one of the pioneering modernist potters in the United States. She was from New York, what we call a red diaper baby, so raised by communists in the interwar period, and then was active at Black Mountain College. a sort of hotbed of avant-garde thinking and making. John Cage, Robert Rauschenberg, and Karen Karns was making pottery at Black Mountain. Karen Karns, for years, made a series of vessels that had sort of a split down the center so that there was this little gap. And Linda Sorman was thinking about those works. And as you could see, if when you see this in person, you'll see that this kind of more solid looking element at the bottom has some of the characteristics of one of these Karen Karns pieces. So in this work, we're seeing an artist like Linda Sorman, who is drawing from her, her particular background as a Thai Canadian woman, also thinking about what it means to be a woman artist within a modernist idiom. She's working in ceramics in a way that's very attentive to history, but not beholden by history. She's also working in a kind of non-precious mode where she's building up and taking down at the same time. She's sort of reassigning meaning to certain aspects of the work. So that would be a shard, something that would be thrown away, she incorporates as an integral element. These are some of the ways that her work is emblematic of, again, a number of the trends that I'm pointing out in contemporary ceramics, but also just gives you a lot to look at. Like, it's just super visually rich. So
I almost see a samurai helmet in there. I don't know why.
Yeah, it looks a little bit like that. She has these kind of these bars. There's all it's a little hard to tell in this image, but there's quite a bit of gold in this work too. Linda Sorman adds gold leaf frequently to her pieces.
Sally-Ann.
Hi, that was a fabulous talk. Thank you very much. I'm interested in what you see as the role of museums. You talked about emerging artists and social practice, and I wonder how you see that museums can support that.
Yeah, that's a great question. The role of museums is really, I mean, it's a great question that all of us are thinking about it in new ways, I would say, as well as sort of longstanding ways. There's really a question now about what our kind of what our obligation, like what our purpose is in society, I suppose. So it's not just about the artist, but it's also about kind of what's our function within the broader culture, and why should museums exist? Like, why are they these collections of objects or sort of ways of looking that come together? When it comes to artists, and in particular in ceramics, as opposed to sort of audiences and publics, I think we can speak about our responsibilities and our roles around audiences a little bit differently. Speaking to the question around artists, I would say a couple of things. One is I feel like museums are important platforms to be able to highlight the works of artists for folks who wouldn't get to see the work otherwise. It's important for museums to support both living and established artists by acquiring their work as well. It's an important function. I would say that a number of artists are also working in ways that can really be fully realized in institutions. So if we think of like the Nadia Mir project, for example, there were the code switching exhibition that I showed the image from. There are a number of individual artworks from that project that can be collected individually, but as a whole project, the only real format to present that in is either a museum or like a university art gallery or a Kunsthal of some kind. There are so many artists now are working in ways that really their work is made for museum or institutional spaces, that I feel like that's an important aspect to support as well.
What happens here. Thank you so very much, everybody, and I hope I'll see you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you again, Sequoia.